10 Stupidest Weapons Ever Built. Once, there was no such thing as a bad weapon. Weapons were simple: clubs, spears, axes, bows and arrows, chariots, lances, pikes, and all were eventually superseded by whatever came along that was incrementally better. For example, though the crossbow lacked the power and range of an English longbow, it wasn't a bad weapon. The longbow was just a better one. Come the Industrial Revolution, however, technology factored into weapon design and engineering, occasionally with disastrous results. We've chosen several such military missteps as examples of what can happen when the delicate balance between utility, usability and effectiveness is upset. Number 1. Great Panjandrum. Nevil Shute, author of On the Beach, A Town Like Alice and other popular novels, was also an aeronautical engineer who was unfortunately responsible for designing one of the silliest weapons of World War II, the Great Panjandrum. Developed under the aegis of the British Admiralty's Directorate of Miscellaneous Weapons Development, it comprised a pair of 10-foot wooden wheels, the axle between them containing a 2-ton drum of TNT. The Panjandrum was to be launched from the ramp of a landing craft just off a Normandy beachhead, from which, in theory anyway, it would roar up the beach at 60 miles per hour and smash into the Atlantic Wall defenses, blowing a tank-size hole in the fortifications, as depicted above. Propelling it were 70 solid-fuel rockets around the rim of each wheel, spinning the entire affair like a crazed Catherine wheel firework. Number 2, Heinkel He-177 Grief. Adolf Hitler himself unflatteringly compared the He-177 long-range heavy bomber to the Panther tank, which at the time was facing its own mechanical problems. This garbage plane is, of course, the biggest piece of junk that was probably ever produced, he said of the 177. It's the Flying Panther, and the Panther is the crawling Heinkel. Though the Panther developed into an excellent tank, the Heinkel's problems plagued it for 4 years before it was finally declared barely fit for production, and by then there was no need for a long-range, 4-engine Luftwaffe bomber. Nazi Germany's sole heavy bomber was its aircraft industry's most dismal failure. Factories rolled out more than 1,100 He-177s, and the entire fleet was a waste of time and material. Number 3, Soviet anti-tank dogs and US bat bombs. The idea to strap explosives to a dog's back and teach it to crawl beneath a German tank was not just inhumane, it wasn't very bright. During World War II the Soviets developed such dog mines, which exploded when a detonating rod hit the tank's belly. Problem was the Soviets used their own T-34s to train the dogs, teaching them to seek treats beneath the tanks. T-34s had diesel engines that stank of kerosene. German tanks, however, were gasoline-fueled and smelled quite different. Amid the noise and confusion of battle, the dogs often sniffed out the familiar-smelling Soviet tanks, with predictable results. The dogs also refused to run beneath moving tanks and were often frightened off by German gunfire, only to flee back to their own trenches and foxholes, where the mines obediently detonated. Number 4, Mark 14 Torpedo. It's hard to imagine anyone deliberately designing a submarine torpedo as bad as the Mark 14, but the Naval Torpedo Station in Newport, RI, managed to pull it off. This U.S. fleet-wide standard torpedo ran 10 to 12 feet below what it had been set for, thanks to a misaligned depth sensor. It also failed to explode when it passed beneath the ship's keel, as its complex Mark 6 magnetic influence exploder had been tested in New England waters that were magnetically very different from the South Pacific. Even when the Mark 14 did manage to hit a ship, the result was often just a loud cling, as the contact exploder would break when the 3,280-pound torpedo hit a steel hull at 46 knots. Number 5, Double-Barreled Cannon. This concept dates from 1642 and Florentine gunmaker Antonio Petrini. He cast the first cannon intended to fire simultaneously from side-by-side barrels, 2 balls linked by a chain, intended to scythe down enemy soldiers like standing wheat when it reached them. The operative word, however, was simultaneously. For the rig to work, the powder behind each round shot had to ignite at the same instant, which, of course, rarely happened. In 1862, Georgia dentist and mechanic John Gilliland raised money from a coterie of Confederate citizens to build the ultimate chain shotgun. Cast in one piece, the gun featured side-by-side bores, each a little over 3 inches in diameter and splayed slightly outward so the shots would diverge and stretch the chain taut. During tests, the Gilliland cannon effectively mowed down trees, tore up a cornfield, knocked down a chimney and killed an unfortunate cow. None of the above were anywhere near the gun's intended target. Number 6, M16 rifle. The modern-day M16A4 is probably the deadliest and most accurate assault rifle ever produced, a point arguable perhaps only by AK-47, aka Macolites. But during the Vietnam War, soldiers and Marines faced injury and even death due to flaws in the early model M16s. Defenders of the M16 insist, the problem wasn't the rifle, it was the ammunition. But that's a little like saying, it was a great airplane, but the engine failed every 10th flight. The rifle did have faults. The M16 was designed to use ammo loaded with extruded powder, a propellant with cylindrical grains. As an economical move, the Army Ordnance Corps decreed a change to ball powder, which had spherical grains and included a calcium carbonate additive to keep it from deteriorating. This allowed the Army to recycle propellant from obsolete rifle ammo and artillery rounds for M16 ammo, and since Ordnance didn't retest the rifle after switching powders, troops in the field became the unfortunate beta testers. Number 7, Blue Peacock nuclear mine. Any device with a nuclear warhead is arguably a candidate for worst weapon, given its inherent risks and often indiscriminate killing power. Nonetheless, we nominate Britain's Blue Peacock as history's most benighted nuclear device. The Blue Peacock project called for the construction of 10 7.2-ton, minivan-sized steel casings, each holding a plutonium weapon with a yield of 10 kilotons. The British Army would bury the devices at strategic points in Germany through which Soviet tanks might rumble. If forced to retreat, the British would fall back to a distance from which each Blue Peacock could be triggered manually. Otherwise, the mines were preloaded with a timer that would blow them in 8 days no matter what. Number 8, Maginot Line. Many French insist the Maginot Line worked perfectly during the opening days of World War II, blocking traditional invasion routes into France and forcing the Germans to avoid it. Problem was the Wehrmacht did just that, bypassing it through the Ardennes forest, and Luftwaffe aircrews went over it wherever they wished. The French developed the Maginot Line in part because in 1918 they had fended off the Germans with fixed defenses, namely trenches. The Maginot was a far more sophisticated complex of fortifications, obstacles and weapons, and though it was the last gasp of a time-worn concept that dated back to the days of coast artillery, forts under siege and hilltop castles, it was by no means just a fancy World War I super trench. Nor was it just a line. In places, the fortifications were 16 miles deep, with zone after zone of specialized gunnery, all linked by tunnels and subterranean rail lines. Number 9, Novgorod. Like Vasa, the infamous Swedish warship that in 1628 keeled over and sank a little over a mile into its maiden voyage, the Russian ironclad Monitor Novgorod had a fatal flaw that only became fully apparent once it had been launched and entered combat on the Black Sea in the 1877–78 Russo-Turkish War. Novgorod has been called the ugliest warship ever built. As round and clumsy as a floating soup dish, the 2,500-ton vessel had 6 steam engines that drove 6 screws. The Russians claimed Novgorod was immune to ramming, as its key components lay well inboard of the ship's 9-inch armored belt line no matter where a rammer hit. Amidships, mounted on swiveling platforms, were two 26-ton, 11-inch muzzle-loaded cannon, big naval guns for the time. As Novgorod's circular hull drafted just 12 feet, far less than it would have had the vessel been designed with a conventional hull. The plan was for the Monitor to cruise just offshore and bombard land targets. Number 10, Panzer VIII Maus. Who thought a tank that could barely move and presented a target the size of a school bus was a good idea? Adolf Hitler, that's who. All tanks are compromises between firepower, armor and mobility, and the Führer wanted one that put the gun first and agility last. The tank carried so much armor that enemy rounds would simply bounce off. And its 150mm main gun would presumably make up for the fact that it typically operated at about 8 miles per hour. The result was the 207-ton Maus, a white elephant among the 25-ton T-34 and Panzer Pygmies. Ferdinand Porsche designed it, and it's hard to imagine that the future engineer of lightweight performance sports cars had his heart in the job. Porsche did engineer a drive system that rendered the Maus a virtual off-the-rails diesel locomotive, a 44.5-liter, 1,200 horsepower inverted V12 aircraft engine drove a huge generator that provided electricity to the two motors that cranked the 3.6-foot wide tracks.